Hi, and welcome to the channel. Today, we're going to be talking about a piece called Don't Come Around Here No More, or a caricature of Tom Petty. Now, I'm a huge fan of Tom Petty. I've been a big fan of his music for a number of years, and this particular piece was inspired by a video that came out, I think, in the late 80s sometime on MTV called Don't Come Around Here No More. If you've seen the image before, you probably know the reference to this. This was something of a kind of play on the old Alice in Wonderland story, but in a very surreal fashion in the music video. If I'm being honest, I saw this when I was a little bit younger. I want to say maybe around 10, 12 years old or so, and the video kind of creeped me out a little bit. It was shot from some very unusual angles with some very kind of odd foreshortening and things like that, and the whole thing kind of came off like this really kind of mystical, surreal dream, but almost kind of bordering on nightmare. It actually kind of turned me off Tom Petty music for a number of years, and I didn't really kind of rediscover him again until roughly around the mid-90s or so when he published the Wildflowers album. And at that point, I kind of rediscovered his music, fell in love with it, went back through the backlog, fell in love with all that again, and even had some opportunity to see him in concert right about the late 90s or so. It was a really good, fun time. Before we go any further and talk about the drawing, I'd just like to take a moment here and do something of a shameless plug for the channel. I am just, shamelessly asking for subscriptions, so if you can just take a moment, hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out a lot. This is a rather small, humble channel, and every subscription helps. In addition, every view helps, so feel free to stop back and, of course, share with friends because subscriptions and views help out a lot. Now that we got that out of the way, let's talk about the drawing itself. Now, I slowed this down quite a bit because I wanted to take a little bit of time and talk about the drawing and the multiple iterations that you're kind of seeing as we kind of go through the beginning portions of this piece. I had an idea in my mind of what I wanted to do, and this harkens back to what I said before about the video. It was very surreal, almost borderline nightmarish, and so extreme angles and extreme kind of perspectives really kind of help sell that surreal feel. And, as kind of a sidebar, I will say that Tom Petty's music really kind of has that kind of almost spooky, dark, ethereal feel to it. Not all of it, but certain songs, especially this one. And for that matter, I really kind of think the whole mood and the genre kind of fits. It's something I really kind of like about his music. Now, back to the drawing itself. You can see here that I'm kind of experimenting with some composition. Again, I had a really clear idea of what I wanted to do, mostly related to the foreground. In the music video, this particular image or scene itself doesn't really exist. I had a lot of reference photos to work off of just from still images of the music video, but there isn't really a scene where you see Alice in the teacup and then Tom Petty sitting in front of that teacup. So I had to kind of grab some elements of different parts of other pictures and kind of put them all together into the composition you see here. And that, in and of itself, is why I'm struggling with a little bit on how to kind of draw the specific caricature of Tom Petty and how to get that hat to kind of line up in the frame that in the way that I wanted to. Again, the idea was to kind of pull off this spooky, ethereal, weird angled feel. And so I really wanted to kind of experiment with some extreme perspective drawing. And that's why you see a lot of guidelines being laid down, and in certain elements you're not even seeing most of his face because I'm trying to kind of get the hat to really kind of sell that over-the-top perspective. I had some basic ideas as to how I wanted to pose the body, but at the same time, again, I wasn't committed to anything. Even though I had a picture in my head, I knew more than anything else what I wanted was to get Tom Petty largely in the foreground there with his face up and close and personal, but also that teacup with Alice sitting in the middle of it. I really felt like that was an essential element to this for me, and I didn't want to give it up. So once I had that foreground with the teacup and Alice in there, the idea was to kind of move Tom Petty around it until I got him in a position that I really liked. And you can see here that I started experimenting with this idea of not even showing most of his face because I thought the hat was really kind of important to selling this extreme foreshortening and perspective that I was going for. I liked the idea for a little bit. I also thought that, if you're familiar with this video, you didn't really need to see Tom Petty's face to know who this was supposed to be. So I could probably get away with hiding his face a little bit. But what I ultimately decided on was to try a couple other positions to see if I could figure out a way to kind of make it work in some other fashion. And this gets back to something I've maybe mentioned in a couple of other videos I posted about just some basic problem solving when you're doing your work. I refuse to kind of work into final stages until I know that I'm 100% happy with what I've got laid down as my groundwork. Trying to come at it and fix things later usually leads to disaster, at least for me. So I think that work of spontaneity really has to kind of happen when you're doing your rough sketches and your outlines. That spontaneity, maybe find some place when you're putting in some tiny details, but when you're working in final stages, that's really where your plan should be coming together, not kind of inventing new things. Again, that's just my method of working. But the initial drawing is where all the experimentation, for me, really kind of happens. Now, again, I wanted to kind of experiment with a couple of different positions before I committed to something that I went into final inks for. So you can see me fooling around here a little bit and also trying to get an idea as to what I wanted to do with his face. Because if I was going to show his face, the music video is very clear that he's wearing sunglasses, and I wanted to represent that as accurately as possible. But at the same time, the sunglasses are going to hide a portion of his face, and that makes it a little bit difficult to get a likeness. So if we speak to the caricature aspect of this for a little bit, if we speak specifically to Tom Petty's face, he does have some unusual features that make him instantly recognizable. But with most caricatures, if you're trying to kind of employ the standard method, you really want to kind of focus on things that just make sure that you kind of nail that resemblance. And a lot of that comes in a T-zone. The T-zone is a reference to that area that's the eyes and the bridge of the nose. So between the eyes and the nose, and to a certain degree the mouth as well, that's really where most of the resemblance of a caricature really kind of comes from. I had to kind of abandon that idea because of the sunglasses and the brim of the hat, so I really had to rely on just some other facial features to really sell this Tom Petty look. Mostly that comes in the nose and the mouth, but for me, in the way that I draw caricatures, a big portion of it is going to be the shape of the head, the shape of the face as well. Ultimately, I feel like I got pretty close with the caricature, and what really kind of helped drive it home was when I was able to put colors in a little bit later, because the colors with the shadow and the light around the mouth really kind of sold something that's very unique to Tom Petty, which is he has something of maybe it's an overbite perhaps. It's that even when his mouth is closed, it looks like his lips are really kind of stretching over his teeth a little bit. So his mouth comes forward more than average, or the average person maybe is the better way to put it. And because that is something that caricature goes for, is that exaggeration of the differing from the norm, I really wanted to try to get that in there because I really feel like that sold this idea of this is definitely Tom Petty. Now, this particular pose that you're looking at here is one I messed around with for quite a bit, and honestly, it wasn't working for me, but I kept thinking I might be able to get it to work if I fool around with it a little bit more. And I think this really kind of speaks to the tenacity of what I'm doing with the rough drawing more than anything else. With this and some of the pieces that I kind of feel like I'm more successful at, one of the things that kind of marks that ability to be successful, again in my eyes and with my own work, is the time that I spent kind of making sure that I got the composition the way that I wanted it to. And so I didn't really like what I was doing with this, but I wasn't quite ready to abandon it yet. And so I fooled around with it for about another hour or two before I said, okay, I'm going to put this aside for a minute, and I'm going to try one more time to see if I can get something a little bit different and a little bit closer to the likeness that I'm going for. Now, in this kind of final version of the rough drawing, which I believe is starting up right now, the focus here was again on the main facial features that I knew that I wanted to exaggerate. And in this case, it's going to be the nose, very skinny, a little bit on the longer side, and then also the mouth, very thin, almost no lips, and it come out a little bit. It's almost a little bit more pronounced because of that overbite that he has. So there's some lines around the chin and the mouth that kind of help remind me to get that in there when I go into the painting phase a little bit later on. The sunglasses again are hiding the eyes, so you could call it something of a cheat or something like that. But believe me, the real challenge, the real problem solving here was to try to get that likeness without the eyes to help out with it. One of the other things I also struggle with is the hat. I am horrible at drawing hats on people, mostly because I struggle with this constantly getting the line work right, so it looks like the hat's actually sitting on the head instead of kind of sitting around it and not fitting the way that it should. It's just something I had to spend some time on and kind of bend some lines around and erase and redraw and erase and redraw, which is kind of what you're seeing now, until I kind of feel like I got it. And again, one of the things that really helps this is the color. Once you get the shadow and the light in, it gives a more rounded look that helps sell that idea that it is actually sitting on the head. And I got a rough sketch down for the head that I decided I was going to be happy with, and so it became time to work on the body. And the shoulders are really hunched like this on purpose because it gets back to that idea of what I wanted to do, which is put this head back on the body and then bring it into the foreground quite a bit to kind of create this really awkward perspective. And so I'm exaggerating this in a couple areas. When I bring the head back in, I'm going to kind of resize it and get it much bigger than it really should be. Then the hunched shoulders there are going to kind of help sell that it is sitting on something of a neck that proportionally would make sense, even though we're not going to see the neck from this camera angle. In addition, take a look at the waist. The waist comes down quite a bit and gets really, really skinny. Not because it's meant to kind of be that way naturally, but because it's helping to sell this idea of this really, really enormously foreshortened perspective. So you can kind of see me putting these elements together right now. I got a rough sketch of the body, I have it sitting behind the teacup, I brought the head back in and I've resized it, and now that I got something I'm relatively happy with, it's time to draw in the chair that he's sitting in behind him. Now, as I'm working through this, I'm working on a lot of different layers. I won't commit to putting everything together until I'm happy that everything is sized and sitting on the page that I want in the way that I want it to. So that foreground of the teacup is its own layer, the head is its own layer, the body, its own layer, and then the chair, another layer on top of that. And as I kind of tweak in some of the details and get everything kind of the way that I want it to and start settling on kind of like the final rough draft of this sketch, what I'll do is eventually pull all these layers together and make one kind of sketch over top of it. Or if I'm kind of happy with it and I'm ready to move forward to inks, I'll just combine them all together into one sketch and go into ink phase from there. But even the ink phase is another situation where I'm working in as many layers as I possibly can. So that way, if I make a mistake, it's really easy to kind of go back and not lose a good portion of my drawing that I spent an enormous amount of time on. This is usually evident when I draw hands. I struggle with hands just as much as anybody else does for the most part, I think. And so sometimes I'll draw a hand in rough, then try to ink it, and it still doesn't come out right. So I'll do maybe 3 or 4 drafts of the inks before it finally gets settled into the way I want it to. And once I get that in, then that separate layer I've created for the hands, I'm able to combine with the rest of the drawing and move forward. Now I've made I've hidden, I guess I should probably say, the layers that apply to the foreground of the figure here, and now I'm working on the background. The wonderful thing about Procreate is that it has these amazing little drawing guides to help you lay in straight lines and little patterns like this. So backgrounds are something I just get a little bit bored with rendering, but this was really easy to lay out because of the drawing guides that the software provides. So laying in this checkerboard background and the checkerboard floor was super simple, so much so that I even experimented with a little bit as to how I wanted the wall to kind of meet up with the floor beneath it. The experiment didn't really work, so I just kind of went back in and filled in a couple more blocks, and within almost no time at all, I was back to working on the drawing itself, which made me super happy because, again, backgrounds, they're kind of a pain, but I do kind of find them to be necessary, especially with this more fully composed piece like this. So the next thing is the chair, and the great thing about the chair is that I also used something of a drawing tool provided by Procreate, the Symmetry Tool. So once I had the kind of rough in and I had an idea of where I wanted it to sit, I did another kind of more finished drawing on top of it using the Symmetry Tool. Now, when you set up the Symmetry Tool, it doesn't have to sit dead center of the page, and in fact, this chair is an example of that. It's sitting slightly to the left. I did this on purpose. I wanted just a kind of more interesting composition in that sense, and then from there, get the body on top of it. Now, let me speak here just a minute to the composition while the inks kind of start up. I'm no graphic design expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I will tell you that there is a reason I try to compose this mostly in center. You will find that there's a lot of composition theory that says that's a bad way to do things, that you want to kind of play rule of thirds and stuff like that. But the reason I'm kind of focusing in mostly center here is because of the way he sits in this piece. He is meant to be the dominating figure here. He is meant to be sitting in this very, kind of regal throne, and that's what the composition is all about. Anytime you kind of put a figure dead center like this, you give them a really serious place of importance, almost a regal, almost royal sense of importance. And if you look at historical artwork like religious figures or kings or presidents and politicians that get portraits made, this is really how that composition works, and it's effective because again it's trying to kind of get a certain kind of focus to this figure to give them almost a regal kind of look and feel. Hopefully that makes sense, but I digress. Let's go ahead and move on with the drawing. So I'm satisfied with the composition. Time to put in the inks. And I may have mentioned this in a couple of other videos, but my inking method is a fairly simple one. I basically draw until I get the line right. So there's a tap method, tap 2 fingers on the screen and that'll erase the last line that you drew. And so I will draw, erase, draw, erase, draw, erase until I get that line exactly the way I want it. And what I'm looking for here more than anything else is just a very smooth line that doesn't get jaggedy or anything like that. There's certainly kind of bumps in some of the lines that I draw, but they're kind of put there on purpose, like around the fabric of the arm and etc. But my curved lines should be like really nice curves without a whole bunch of jiggle in the wrists, so to speak. And that's what it means to have clean lines for me. In addition, if I'm not working on something like a tabletop or a chair, for instance, that should have very distinctly straight lines, I always want to work with something that gives me some line weight. Again, something I mentioned in a video before, but I think it kind of bears mentioning again. When it comes to line weight, I really kind of follow the theory that's kind of put forward by people that draw comic books on a regular basis. This was just kind of a big part of my artistic upbringing. I used to just draw and redraw superheroes in comic books all the time when I was a teenager. And one of the things you start learning is the importance of line weight and how that makes a figure sit on the page. So this is what I mean. Thin lines and thick lines help kind of, give a concept of form. A line, more than anything else, is almost like a primitive form of drawing shadow. And if you think about it that way, then line weight starts to make a little bit more sense. So for instance, in places where I want to kind of portray shadow, or at the very least something that's away from the source of light, like perhaps the back of the brim of his hat, for instance, or portions of the underside of his sleeves and his waistline, those are going to be thicker lines, meant to kind of represent or give the hint of shadow. But anything that's going to be closer to the light source is going to be something that's a thinner line. In addition, if I want the figure to kind of pop on the page, I can also put a bold outline around areas that I want to pop and thinner lines around areas where I want kind of more detail. Now, I didn't follow those rules strictly on this one, and there was one main reason for that. For this particular piece, I had an idea really early on that my line work was something I wanted to kind of hide a little bit. I was going to change some of the coloring, match it up with the colors surrounding it, like flesh tones and things like that, and try to kind of, not so much make it disappear, but just hide it a little bit so it didn't look like this big, bold black outline around everything. I like to work with these outlines. It makes it a little bit easier for me to get coloring done and get rendering of shadow and light done. So I'm working this phase because it's kind of part of my method. But eventually, when I kind of get most of the coloring done and I'm working the final details, I'm going to try to recolor these lines and just slowly make them kind of, again, just hide them a little bit, make them disappear to a certain degree. Now, as we're finishing up here on the line work, again, notice at this point I've changed brushes. I'm working with a inking brush that gives you a straight line, no taper, so that way I can boldly put in that block of the table and make sure I get my circles right in the teacup. Now, note about this, the perspective, I'm trying to get the circles right in this teacup, especially the circles where Alice is sitting in there. It took forever. It was really, really tough to kind of think about and imagine perspective of circles rather than straight lines. So, if you go back to those old high school days or middle school days when you were in your art class thinking about train tracks going in the distance and straight lines leading to a vanishing point, that stuff, I remember quite distinctly. And again, the perspective guides in Procreate kind of help you out with that. But there's nothing like that for circles. So if the angle of the circle just isn't just right, Alice doesn't look like she's sitting in the tea or the liquid, and the whole thing is just defeated. So I spent a good amount of time, even though I sped up the time lapse for you there a little bit, I spent an enormous amount of time trying to make sure those circles lined up perfectly to give that illusion of the perspective that I was looking for. And really, that's what makes this line drawing so complex and also so long in terms of the video that you're seeing here. Trying to get the perspective right between the chin going up to the hat and then in the bowl sitting in the teacup sitting in the foreground, along with the perspective of the chair arms. All this stuff had to line up, and if any of those lines were a little bit off or not at the quite right angle, it was just going to be really ugly to the eye. And so I struggled to get it right, and until I got it right, I wasn't going to move on. That's just kind of the moral of the story, so to speak. And that finishes things up with our final line drawing. So please, come on back, take a look at the next video, part 2, where we'll take a look at the coloring method, taking a closer look at the shadow and the light sources, and having a lot of fun with trying to render tea and making it look somewhat real. So I hope you come back, and if you haven't had a chance to already, don't forget to click that subscribe button. Thanks again for stopping by. Hope to see you again soon. We'll have some more content posted in the near future. Take care.